Okay, back for part two. So we talked about how businesses were failing, how people were losing jobs, and how the stock market crashed and what that caused to happen as far as people losing money there. And now the other thing here is the banks, and I've kind of mentioned this a little bit. So banks failed for three reasons mostly. Banks were not very responsible with who they gave money to and how much they gave out. And so if you pretty much had a pulse and could hold down solid food, you could get a loan at a pretty low interest rate. Okay. People were buying stocks on margin. And so they were borrowing money to be able to gamble on the stock market with. And that's like borrowing $1,000 and going into Vegas and thinking that you're going to make $3,000 and to be able to pay the bank back and then be able to make some on top. It's not going to happen to very many people. Okay. So specifically when they loaned credit on margin, when stocks fell, speculators then defaulted on their loans for the stocks that they were buying on margin. And then when banks didn't have the actual cash, they then started to call in their loans, just like in the game where it talked about Gotham Bank and how it needed to call in its loans because of the fact that they were losing so much money on stocks that had been bought on margin. So that's one way they start losing money, giving too much money or extending too much credit to speculators in the stock market. Number two, banks were investing depositors' money. So if you go and you deposit your money into the bank, that money doesn't just sit there. They use your money to make more money. They can lend it out to people in loans, and then people pay back the loans with the interest rate, and that's how they make money. They also can take your money and then buy stocks with it and play the stock market with your money in order to make more money off of your money. And so when stocks had good returns, there was no problem. They had more money then to be able to lend to people, and banks were doing great at that point. However, when the stock market crashed and businesses failed, then they lost depositors' money. All right. And then when people come to get their money out, especially if they get worried, then they're not going to have that cash on hand, and they've been irresponsible with the money that the people, the depositors, have put in there, and that's a problem. Then what it leads to is bank runs. If there is any kind of hint that a bank is going to fail, or if there's a stock market crash, or if there's a company that starts to lay off people, or whatever the case is, people are going to get nervous that have money in that bank, and as a result, they're going to run to that bank and they're going to want to withdraw their money and have it in hand. Okay, and so what you call that is a run on a bank. And so people come up, they want their deposits back, they want to withdraw their money, and if enough people do that in a day, then the bank is not going to have enough cash on hand to give money to all of those people. And then what they're going to have to do, then what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to close the doors and hope, that nobody's going to be coming around and banging on the windows, and which did happen sometimes. And the thing is then they call in their loans. Then they call all the people that they've loaned money to and say, hey, we need you to pay us back right now so that we can have money to give to these people who are coming to withdraw. And if they can't get that cash from people who have borrowed money from them, then they're in trouble, and the bank may not open again. It may fail right then. It may fire all the people, liquidate everything it has, and be done with it. And so you could be a very responsible person. You could have never played the stock market. You could have been an honest, good worker. And the only mistake you made was to deposit your money into a bank. And then the bank was irresponsible with your money and lost your money. And you're out of a job now, and you have no savings, and you have no cash, and now you've got all these financial needs that need to be met, and they're not going to be met, and so you're going to lose everything you got, or sell it to have some cash. All right, so as I mentioned during the 20s, the government wanted people to go in and to get money. They wanted people to borrow because that was going to prime the pump of the economy. However, when things are going well, when the economy is going well, typically the government says, let's raise interest rates. Only really responsible people who really need the money that are going to pay it back are going to borrow. And so, unfortunately, they didn't know that at the time, and so they just kept the interest rates low, which encouraged lending. And so credit was extended too freely. All right. So after the stock market crash, and after these banks started to fail, and after these businesses started to fail, the federal government decided, well, I guess maybe we've had the interest rate too low for too long. And so they decided to raise the interest rates. Now, what this did was this totally froze up credit. Nobody could get any money, and businesses or banks that maybe needed a little loan in order to be able to get over the hump and just barely survive aren't going to get that money because interest rates are so high, there's no way they can afford to be able to borrow. So this made money very unavailable. It totally froze up credit, and it made those businesses fail even worse. And so this move by the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates was guaranteeing that things were going to be even harder. And it's going to be harder longer with the Great Depression. So another thing, like I mentioned yesterday, was that during the 20s, tariffs high tariffs had killed foreign trade. And so it guaranteed that we weren't going to trade with other countries. There had been efforts, like we've talked about, to lower the interest or to lower the tariff rates, but that didn't happen very much. Okay, so tariffs were high anyway. After the crash happened, and after these banks failed, and after these businesses started to go down, they did the knee-jerk reaction thing that they had always done when the government needed to make money, and that was raise tariffs. And so the Republicans then, Hawley and Smoot, one guy was a senator and one guy was a representative, they got passed through Congress the Hawley-Smoot tariff, and it raised interest rates very, very high. And so the interest rates, or excuse me, not the interest rates, the tariff rates were at 38.5%, and they raised them to 60%. And that guaranteed that was going to cut off trade with everyone. And so we had a surplus of goods stacked up in warehouses all over the country. And when they raised tariffs, this guaranteed that they were not going to be trading or selling to any other countries because they were going to do the exact same thing. And if we hadn't raised these tariffs, if we had dropped tariffs, we might have been able to open up international trade and at least get something for these surplus goods instead of nothing. But when they raised the tariff, that guaranteed, once again, just like what they did with the interest rates, that this Great Depression was going to be great for a long time, and it was going to be really hard to get out of. So the government then says, many people look at the government and say, what are you going to do about it? And so the day after Black Thursday, President Hoover downplayed the crash. He tried to say, oh, this is not a big deal, tried to downplay it in order to keep panic low, and he believed in what's called volunteerism. He believed that it was not going to be the government's responsibility to help the economy bounce back. He believed that private individuals and churches and private charities were going to pick up the burden and responsibility of helping these poor people out that had lost their jobs, and that it wasn't the government's job to step in. He organized conferences with business leaders, and he made them pledge to him that they would keep the factories open, that they would keep everything going, that they wouldn't cut jobs, that they wouldn't cut wages. But by 1931, there was no way that anybody could keep that promise, because you can't run a business if you don't have money, and they didn't have any money. And so this is a quote from Hoover the day after the crash. He said, "The fundamental business of the country is on a sound and prosperous basis." And he believed in that wholeheartedly, that we were going to bounce back, that all we needed to do is pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and go to work. But nobody could go to work because nobody had any money to get paid. And so this was a depression that nobody expected, and nobody knew even close how to get out of. So, all right, we'll go to part 3 here.